Wherever you want.
Come on.
Where do you want to be?
Where do we want to be?
I know. Here, like that?
That's good.
All right.
That's what we thought, right? Further back even. Can you go further back?
Okay.
Oh, that's good. Now I can sort of blend in with the audience.
Ready to start? Yeah, you can. This is still loading, but it's okay. It's still recording on this as well.
Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to a special public session of the annual meeting of the American Society for Existential Phenomenology. It's no secret that Bert Dreyfus is the reason for the existence of the Society, and his work is at the heart of the organization. So we wanted to devote a session to talking about Bert and his influence. I'd like to thank the Berkeley Philosophy Department for allowing me to organize a conference from Southern California. I know that must be painful to have us Southerners in charge of anything here, but I'm grateful to that, especially to Hannah and Alva and the staff here for their help in putting this together. And I'd like to express special gratitude to Genevieve, who has been quietly instrumental to the success not just of our meeting this year, but to the Society right from its beginning. She has played a very instrumental and vital role in our success. Recently, I was cornered by a philosopher, a prominent scholar of 19th century European philosophy, who asked me if I could explain what's distinctive about Bert's approach to Heidegger. So I started by talking about how Bert interprets Heidegger as founding philosophy on a phenomenology of everyday coping skills, and argues that skillful coping is the basis of all intelligibility. I then went on to talk about how Bert's Heidegger thinks that the understanding of being is embodied in non-representational background practices of a culture. And at that point I was interrupted by the scholar. "Hold on," the scholar exclaimed, "that's just standard Heidegger. Everybody knows that. I want to know what Dreyfus adds to the picture." I think one of the clearest indications of Bert's influence on contemporary philosophy is the fact that his reading of Heidegger has indeed become standard Heidegger. And one of the definitive features of Bert's work is the way that he successfully intertwines the interpretation of texts with his own analysis and description of the phenomena at issue. In fact, those two tasks, textual exegesis and phenomenological description, are for Bert necessarily dependent on each other. Nowhere is this clearer than in Bert's interpretation of Heidegger. And in approaching philosophy in this way, Bert is really an heir to Heidegger's own historically oriented style of phenomenology. For instance, in his lectures on Nietzsche, Heidegger observed that, quote, "description and interpretation are meshed in such a way that it's not always and immediately clear what is taken from Nietzsche's words and what has been added to them," unquote. And Heidegger went on to explain, quote, "of course, every interpretation must not only take things from the text, but must also, without forcing the matter, be able quietly to give something of its own concerns. This something extra is what the layman, comparing it to what he takes to be the content of the text, devoid of all interpretation, necessarily deplores as interpolation and sheer caprice." You could say much the same thing, I think, about Bert's approach to philosophy. When he interprets Heidegger and other thinkers in the existential phenomenological tradition, he meshes description and interpretation quietly, as Heidegger put it, giving something of his own to the text. For example, Bert writes, quote, "how does one go about clarifying and applying a thinker like Heidegger, since Heidegger, unlike contemporary analytic philosophers who attempt to give a logical analysis of concepts, always attempts to anchor his discussion in the phenomena, I try to use his text to draw attention to pervasive phenomena that are often overlooked, and then use an elaboration of these phenomena to cast exegetical light on the text," end quote. For Bert, as for Heidegger, it's always the phenomena that are ultimately determinative for an interpretation. At the same time, Bert seems as committed to Heidegger to the thought that, quote, one cannot think without thinking historically, end quote. Thus, Dreyfus always philosophizes in a kind of dialogue with thinkers in the history of philosophy. Their texts direct him to the phenomenon in question, but it's ultimately his own understanding of the phenomenon that drives his reading of their works. At times, this leads Bert to conclude that a thinker, like Heidegger, is, as he puts it, genuinely confused, or sometimes in class he'll put it a little more strongly, that what this eminent philosopher has written is a disaster. That's a judgment he doesn't arrive at lightly, but he's not afraid to reach that conclusion when he can't make sense of the text in light of the phenomena. As Bert then has argued, it's more important to relate a text to current concerns rather than freezing the text in the past. He writes at one point, for example, quote, "It has always seemed to me that the text of a thinker is only worth studying if reading it makes a significant difference in how we see the world and ourselves. Our job as commentators is to clarify the text and bring out its relevance," end quote. On his approach, a text is best understood when we share passionately in the questions that it poses. And when answering those questions is ultimately more important to us than fidelity to the original meaning of the work in question. As a result, Bert, like Heidegger before him, is sometimes accused of indulging in violent and willful interpretations of the philosophers that he takes as his interlocutors. As one reviewer of Being in the World put it, quote, "The attempt to enlist Heidegger in contemporary projects blinds him to the specific European dimension of Heidegger's thought," end quote. But I think both Bert and Heidegger himself would see such complaints as symptoms of an overly narrow view of what good historical philosophizing should aspire to. One can think of different approaches to philosophy as falling on a spectrum. At one extreme, philosophy is practiced as the interpretation of historical texts with a regulative ideal of perfect exegetical fidelity to the original meaning as intended by its author. At the other extreme, philosophy is practiced as problem solving, as taking up timeless philosophical problems and working out solutions to the challenges they pose, or at least to a dissolution of the appearance of a problem. And I suspect there are good reasons to actually doubt the viability of a position at either extreme of this spectrum. Every philosophical problem is indelibly shaped by the historical conditions under which it arises and by the forms of life and patterns of thought that make it a salient issue. It's naive to try to treat questions in philosophy without at least some appreciation for the history that generates them. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's equally naive to think that we could get access to the meaning of a philosopher's words without ourselves taking a look at the matter that provoked his or her reflection. What Bert gets, and many so-called continental philosophers miss, is that Heidegger himself oriented his own work far along toward the living questions end of the spectrum. He saw himself as really involved in addressing problems and trying to resolve them. So Heidegger insisted that true fidelity to a philosophical text requires the interpreter to go beyond the thinker's own understanding of his works. Heidegger insisted that the wish, this is a quote, "the wish to understand a thinker in his own terms is something else entirely than the attempt to think up a thinker's quest and pursue it to the core of his thoughts problematic. The first, that is, understanding a thinker entirely in his own terms, the first," Heidegger said, "is and remains impossible. The second, pursuing a thinker's quest, is rare and of all things the most difficult." Bert Dreyfus has, in my opinion, succeeded in this rare and most difficult task. He's taken up the quest of existential thinkers like Heidegger and Kierkegaard and Merleau-Ponty. Yesterday, for instance, on my way to Berkeley for this meeting, I received an email. It read, quote, "I am a philosophy professor immersed in the analytic world, and I have become mind-numbed because of it," I'm not sure if mind-numbed is a term of art in analytic philosophy, but I think I get the basic gist. The letter writer continues, quote, I ordered the book Skillful Coping, that's Bert's first volume of collected papers. I ordered the book Skillful Coping, discovered the phenomenological tradition, and it has re-enchanted my love of philosophy. End quote. I suspect that many of us here today have had a similar experience of being enchanted or re-enchanted by Bert's unique brand of existential philosophy. In putting the session together, it occurred to me to ask speakers to come who represent different categories of people who have engaged with Bert. So today we're going to hear first from Professor Bill Blatner of Georgetown University. For me, he represents Bert's undergraduate students. We'll next hear from Professor Alvin Noe of Berkeley, who represents Bert's colleagues. And then we'll hear Professor Sean Kelly of Harvard, representing Bert's graduate students. We'll proceed in that order. I've asked the speakers to go for about 50 minutes. Well, there may be time for questions. We'll see. It's up to them. But they have about 50 minutes. We'll take short breaks in between, but we'll just proceed in that order. So, Bill Blatner.
Actually, I have a handout just with quotes, since quotes are hard to listen to. You can pass those around. That would be great. Contraption there. Oh, here.
Yeah.
Be careful what I say. Okay, well, we're here today to honor Bert Dreyfus for his contributions to philosophy, both in the form of his publications and in his role as teacher. Since my focus today will be on Dreyfus's contribution to Heidegger studies, in this context it's worth reminding ourselves that the late John Hoagland, along with Charles Guignon and John Richardson, who's here today, were only the first wave in a long line of students, either directly trained by Bert or trained by Bert's students, so grand students of the sort. Most of us have sought to develop Dreyfus's fundamental approach, though obviously in varying ways. As most of you probably know, Dreyfus's magisterial commentary on Being in Time, which he titled Being in the World, had circulated widely in draft form before it was published in 1991, and it served as the basis for Dreyfus's regular courses on Being in Time. I had the privilege of taking one of those courses during the winter quarter of 1982. And I took the course on a dare, I should say, because I was convinced it had to be nonsense. And I never looked back. In time, a large group of scholars, many of them students of Bert's, but some of them not, coalesced around Dreyfus's fundamental approach to being in time. These students worked out Bert's ideas, challenged them, tweaked them, defended them. The only way that I really know how to honor Bert is to do just that, to challenge some of his ideas, ultimately today defend them, and in the process to tweak them a little bit. That is how Bert taught me to do philosophy, and that's what I'll do today. Now I'll try, given the sort of mixed nature of the audience, I'll try not to go too far down into the weeds with the reading this passage and that of Heidegger, but it's sort of compulsive on my part. So let's hope that I'm lucky. And I'm also going to set this thing to warn me to stop. Okay, so first let me set the stage for what I want to talk about. Prior to the work of Dreyfus and his students, there was not much serious analytical reconstructive work on Being in Time. There were many other forms of engagement with Being in Time, summaries and so on, but not a lot of serious reconstructive work of the kind that the philosophical community is used to when they read Kant or Aristotle or Plato. What distinguished Bert's work, and the work of his students, from most but not all of the prior work on Heidegger, was a twin commitment to an exact interpretation of the text and to deploying the insights and tools of contemporary mainstream Anglophone philosophy in developing, assessing, and presenting Being in Time to the philosophical community. Dreyfus developed his approach to Heidegger at a time when internecine battles raged among American philosophers between those who identified as analytic philosophers and those who did so as continental philosophers. I'm on record arguing that these fault lines were more sociological and academic political than real, and Bert's career is a testament to that belief of mine. But even if I'm right about that, these tensions deeply distorted the social reality of the profession. Dreyfus's approach to Heidegger ruffled feathers on both sides of these battle lines, and so he became a target of a lot of criticism and a certain degree of hostility. I have a lot of people filling my ears with tirades about Bert's work on Heidegger. Now, especially galling to traditionalist approaches to Heidegger was Dreyfus's overt attempt to demonstrate on some issues a proximity of being in time to the work of both Wittgenstein and Quine. It is here, in particular with the proposed proximity of Heidegger to Wittgenstein, that I would like to focus my exploration today. The thesis that Dasein is inherently social is a centerpiece of Dreyfus's approach to interpreting being in time. Dreyfus's revolutionary move was a new interpretation of Heidegger's concept of das Man, which I will render as the anyone, on which the anyone is a name for the background social normativity in virtue of which the public world is constituted. Dreyfus seizes on passages in which Heidegger writes that the anyone, quote, sketches out in advance the primary interpretation of the world and, quote, articulates the assignment context of significance. That is, the appropriate meaning and use of everyday entities. Dreyfus asserts a close relationship between the anyone and being in time and Wittgenstein's concept of the form of life. This approach to Dasein's sociality, or being with, Mitsein in German, directly conflicts with a fundamental assumption of most interpretations of being in time that are oriented towards existentialism. The traditional existentialist interpretations of being in time were deeply influenced by Sartre's individualist existential phenomenology. Two English language authors with whom we may associate this existentialist reading of Heidegger are Marjorie Green and Frederick Olofsson, both of whom approached Heidegger through the lens provided by Sartre. In a 1952 article in the journal Ethics, Green wrote, quote, contrasted with what such genuine existence, authenticity, there is falling, the distraction or scattering of one's freedom in the cares of every day, where not the true individual, but das Man, the indifferent they, is sovereign. The dominant force in everyday life on this reading is an anonymous, oppressive, social conformism, one that robs us of our individuality and thereby prevents us from being authentic. As a domineering force that dissolves us into the great mass of our fellows, the anyone is, as Olofsson put the point, quote, a distorted modality of being with, in which we all systematically detour around one another and ourselves in our authentic capacity as Dasein. Now, Dreyfus's reconstruction of the concept of the anyone is entirely different. On Dreyfus's reading, the anonymous social normativity that governs Dasein's existence is constituted by what Heidegger calls distantiality, Abständigkeit in German, subjugation, Botmäßigkeit, and averageness, Durchschnittlichkeit. Here is a quick, but I hope accurate summary of how Dreyfus and many of those influenced by him interpret these concepts. As Dreyfus develops the idea in Chapter 8 of Being in the World, distantiality is an unease or even anxiety about the way in which one deviates from a public norm. Human life is governed by a background, anonymous social normativity, a set of what we might imprecisely call expectations or conventions for how individuals should conduct themselves. We express the expectations in what is, in English, an increasingly antiquated form, at least judging from my students' writing, by saying one does X or one doesn't do Y. Dreyfus's favorite example of this phenomenon, one that Hoagland as well develops in great detail, is pronunciation. The idea is that when someone pronounces, say, the word slate, like slat, the deviation from the norm stands out and disturbs us. We respond by repeating back the word, but pronounced correctly. I actually think this is much more common amongst professors than regular people. But in doing this, we subjugate our interlocutor to the standard pronunciation. The effect of this subjugation is to herd people into a common pattern of pronunciation, or what Heidegger calls averageness. Dreyfus points out that by averageness, Heidegger did not mean a statistical averaging, but rather the establishment of a norm. Hoagland captures this function in his choice of the term standardization. Standardization is precisely the process of pressuring agents to act in like ways that are taken to be authoritative. Distantiality and subjugation are constitutive moments of the anyone on Burke's reading. They result in a social world in which our behaviors are mutually intelligible to us precisely because our activity has been standardized. If we all pronounced words differently, if we did not adhere to grammatical rules, there would be no uniformity in our language. It would be chaos, a heap of atomistic individuals doing their own things, mutually unintelligible. For this reason, Dreyfus seizes upon Heidegger's italicized statement. I'll never forget Bert explaining in one course that if a sentence is italicized, it should be preferred. He called it the Dagfinn principle, named after Dagfinn Philistotle. Evidently Dagfinn had said this at some point. Heidegger writes in italics, the anyone is an existential, which is an essential feature of Dasein's being, and belongs as an originary phenomenon to the positive constitution of Dasein. By positive, Heidegger means that it is not a deficient mode of something else. To use Olufsen's language to phrase a rebuttal of Olufsen, the anyone is not a distorted form of anything. Dreyfus's proposal that the anyone is not a distorted form of being with, but rather a constitutive moment in our being, revolutionized the way scholars, especially in the English-speaking world, approached Heidegger. In 1994, Olufsen responded to Dreyfus with a critique that bore the illustrative title Heidegger a la Wittgenstein, or Coping with Professor Dreyfus. Taylor Carman rose to Dreyfus's defense, and Dreyfus, a year later, contributed a damage assessment, concluding that his fundamental principle remained standing. Now, what I want to do now to go down a bit further into the weeds is to consider an objection to Dreyfus's reading of the anyone that I think has gotten very little attention in mainstream Heidegger studies. It's a critique of Dreyfus's reading of the anyone that was offered by Johannes Fritzsche in 2003. And he raises a number of objections to interpreting distantiality as an unease or anxiety with deviation from a public norm. So in passage 1 on the handout, this is the paragraph in which Heidegger uses or introduces the term distantiality. And I just want to look quickly at the first few sentences. In concern for what one has grabbed hold of, with, for, or against others, there constantly rests a care for the distinction from others, whether it be in order to balance out the distinction from others, to catch up with others when one has fallen behind them, to hold others back when one has some preeminence over them. Being with one another is, in a manner, hidden from itself in its care of substantiality. Now, there are two features of the language that Heidegger uses that sit awkwardly with Burke's reading. First, deviation does not inherently generate any dimension of preeminence or inferiority. Yet Heidegger's elaboration of the form of distance, Abstand, that he is concerned with, draws on precisely such a scale of preeminence, or Heidegger's word is Vorrang. He cites balancing out the distinction between oneself and others, catching up with them, or maintaining one's preeminence. One is reminded of Nietzsche's language of the pathos of distance. Although Nietzsche used the word Distanz rather than Abstand, it's not too far a stretch to hear a connection. Second, Heidegger uses the phrase Sorge to express our relation or attitude toward the distance between ourselves and others. The natural use of this construction in German might best be translated into English as caring for. Fritzsche uses the example of a jogger answering the question, why do you jog? With the response, ich sorge um meine Gesundheit. I care for or about my health. I'm seeking to promote my health, not eliminate it. If Fritzsche's observations are right, then a different picture begins to come into focus. The passage on distantiality is not about tamping down deviation from norms so as to produce standardized conduct, but rather about competing with others so as to catch up with them, or, even better, maintain one's preeminence over them. As Fritzsche puts it in the title of his article, distantiality is a description of competition, not conformity. Now, if Fritzsche is right, we have to ask, how does such competition lead to subjugation and ultimately leveling down? And I'm not going to go into detail on what Fritzsche says here, just to give the sort of basic idea. Fritzsche adverts to accounts of the competitive market in Kant, Hegel, and Hegel's epiphany, Karl Ludwig Michelet. The overall tenor of the paragraph that we were looking at from distantiality does not point towards specifically market-based or economic competition, so I don't fully buy what Fritzsche is doing there. But we can generalize the dynamics of competition that he explores, especially as identified by Hegel and Michelet, and arrive at a characterization of how social competition leads to conformism, or the dominance of what Michelet calls fashion. And then I have a passage 2 is from Michelet. We don't need to go through it in detail, but the idea is that refinement and fashion constantly chase each other and push each other forward. And what this then creates is a cycle of the creation of the new, which is immediately becomes passé, overnight becomes something widely known, as Heidegger puts it. And so through that kind of process, this social competition leads to a kind of leveling down, a kind of sameness. You all remember when the iPhone came out, it was the latest, greatest thing, and a month later it was like, you don't have an iPhone? What's wrong with you? You're lagging behind. Now, if we go back to the paragraphs of section 27, with Fritzsche's hypothesis in mind, we'll be read to lead section 27 otherwise than is common in Anglophone Heidegger studies. Section 27 begins with the discussion of the way the others present themselves or encounter us in everyday life. The second paragraph is the one about distantiality. The third paragraph then argues that competitive distantiality leads to subjugation to the others. This suggests an analysis according to which our competitive behavior makes us subservient to or subjugated to the others. It is here in the context of subjugation that Heidegger first deploys the term das Mann, the anyone. And here we should look at the passage. This is number 3, and we'll begin 3 lines in. These others to whom we are subjugated are not thereby determinate others. On the contrary, every other can represent them. Decisive is only the inconspicuous domination by the others that is already taken over from Dasein as being with. One belongs to the others, oneself, and enhances their power. The others, as one calls them in order to cover up one's own essential belonging to them, are those who primarily and usually are there in everyday being with one another. The who is not this one and not that one, not one oneself and not several and not some of them all. The who is the neuter, das Mann, the anyone. Now, how does Heidegger work his way to the notion of the anyone here? He begins by observing that distantiality leads to a form of subjugation to the others, a dependency upon their judgment and esteem in the competition. He then asks who these others are to whom we are subjugated. He says first that they're not determinate others. That is, his point is not that I am subjugated, say, to the coolest kid in the lunchroom, the quarterback of the football team, the head cheerleader, the star of my department. I went to a high school in Southern California where the quarterback of the football team dated the head cheerleader. Lots of social competition there. Every other can represent the others to whom I am subjugated, he says. If I am subjugated to a standard embodied by a person with whom I am competing, a standard that is publicly recognized or recognized within my group, then any member of the group can represent the others here. Anyone in my department can say to me, wow, her CV is 10 times as long as yours. He then further adds that we use the phrase the others to cover up our own essential belonging to them. Indeed, I can represent the others and subjugate myself to them. I can fret about my social standing, about not having the H index of my department superstar. The others, therefore, can be everyone, a few people, a particular other, or even me, which is to say that essentially the others are not any of these. He then introduces the term the anyone. It is a generalized, abstract reference to whoever it might be who is enforcing subjugation in any context. So we have a picture in which social competition is officiated, if you will, by everyone and no one.